Resumed. It is time for questions to the Minister of Justice. Questions 9 and 13 have been withdrawn. I call Alan Robinson.
Question number 1, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Minister.
The management of the PSNI estate is an operational matter for the Chief Constable, who is accountable to the Northern Ireland Policing Board. I am committed to respecting the operational independence of the Chief Constable and the role of the Policing Board. As I have not had any discussions on this matter, it is therefore suggested that the member should write directly to the Chief Constable.
Robinson.
I thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her response. Does the Minister agree with me that it would be entirely wrong that police stations such as Limavady would be closed as a sacrificial lamb to help pay the £750,000 ICO fine and other subsequent costs following last year's data breach?
Well, as I've already said, it isn't a matter for me to opine on the right decisions for the PSNI to live within budget. That is entirely a matter for the Chief Constable, and he has operational independence in that matter, but is also operationally accountable to the Policing Board for those decisions. However, with respect to the ICO fine, you will be aware that the PSNI did considerable work in order to reduce the size of the fine. I wrote to the ICO myself to make those representations, because I do believe that public money being taken out of the police purse at this time is likely only to increase pressure on the very people who were impacted by that data breach.
Mr McNulty.
Can the Minister outline the time frame for the closing of Crossmaglen Police Station as per the recommendations of the South Armagh Policing Review?
Well, I would refer the member to my answer to both of the previous questions. The management of the policing estate is a matter for the Chief Constable in cooperation with the Policing Board. It is not a matter which falls to me as Justice Minister, nor would it be appropriate for me to breach the boundaries in terms of the tripartite arrangement to reach in or control that. But I would encourage the member to write to the Chief Constable, who may be able to furnish him with some further information in that regard.
Paul Joanne Bunting.
Speaker, question 2, please.
My department has progressed significant preparatory work to bring forward domestic abuse protection notices and orders. However, as members will be aware, the statutory requirement to lay regulations has not been met. My officials are continuing to work with partners to resolve a number of significant and complex operational challenges to ensure that the regime is affordable and deliverable, and crucially that it will enhance the protections that are available to those who are most at risk of harm. However, we are determined to make progress, and my officials intend to provide a further update to the Justice Committee on this work in December. I believe the introduction of domestic abuse protection notices would make a real difference to the safety of those at risk of harm from domestic abuse, and I'm keen to find the best way to progress it. My department's high-level estimate is that the total new costs arising from the proposed DAP and DAPO regime is likely to be in excess of £12 million in year 1, rising to over £17 million by year 3. This is not currently affordable within my department's current budget, and so resources will need to be made available to support their introduction. These have been identified as a pressure with the Department of Finance. However, cost is not the sole reason for not bringing DAPNs and DAPOs forward at this time. My officials are also exploring other operational factors with partners to ensure that the eventual model is effective, adds value and is operationally deliverable.
Joanne Bunting for supplementary.
Thank you, and I'm grateful to the Minister for her answer. She will appreciate that in the current climate it's important that all options are available to help people who find themselves in these situations. She cited the year-on-year costs, which are indeed significant for the department. Could she outline perhaps why that is, the rationale behind the year-on-year increases, and perhaps how this reflects on the potential success of various strategies?
In terms of the success of various strategies, there are a number of strands to the member's question. I think the first thing to say is that the rise, if you like, is likely to increase and then level out as people become more familiar with the use of the system. So that's why it goes from 12 to 17, and then that's likely to be maintained at that level. The issue with respect to the cost, it's very hard to know exactly how many of these will come forward, but we've done it based on an estimate which we've looked at in terms of what's happening in other jurisdictions where these have not been introduced successfully and where they have been judged not to add value. And so we're trying to take account of that learning. However, We are working with the PSNI and the Department of Health, identifying not just how we can better introduce DAPOs and DAPINs with the right underpinning regulations, but also identifying a number of further measures we believe would also help to enhance the protection of those at risk from harm of domestic abuse. That includes investment in services to address offending behaviour, measures to enhance multi-agency work to assess and mitigate the risk posed to victims of domestic abuse, investment in technologies that would support the PSNI response, and measures to reinforce the ability of health and social care to support those at risk. Again, additional resources will be needed for this. We have included DAPOs and DAPINs as an inescapable pressure because there is a statutory duty on the Department to deliver these, but that requirement has not been met, and we would need additional resources which we bid for through the transformation bid in VOG. Again, that bid was not agreed.
Conor Egan.
And thank the Minister for her answers so far. Minister, could you perhaps clarify whether these difficulties were unforeseen or were concerns raised at the time?
Sure.
This originated actually as a committee amendment at consideration stage of the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act. Whilst we noted as a department the merit potentially of notices and orders, we didn't support that amendment because there are significant concerns that we had at the time about including in secondary legislation rather than primary legislation this level of detail. We also raised concerns, I think, about the restrictive 2-year time frame because this was an untried and untested policy. It had been legislated for in Scotland but hadn't been operationalised, and it was only when it was operationalised that they then realised the extent of the problem, and it is also affecting implementation in England and Wales. However, we are committed to introducing them, and I want to reassure members of that. I do believe that there is a mechanism by which we can ensure that these add value to the current protective mechanisms, including, for example, non-molestation orders. So it's about ensuring there is additionality, but also crucially that we only introduce them at a point where they're properly resourced, because if people go as victims seeking protection and that protection fails, I think that is a real issue for us. So we have to be sure whatever we introduce is operationally sensible and deliverable.
Jonathan Buckley.
Speaker, question number 3.
Minister.
I'm satisfied the planned investment in a new kitchen and cafe at Magilligan Prison represents a necessary investment of the limited capital resources made available to my department. The existing buildings were constructed as a temporary facility and have been in place since 1990. They were designed to provide meals to 300 prisoners 3 times a day. However, the population at Magilligan is now at its maximum capacity of 500 prisoners. The current facilities have served well beyond their lifespan and are not fit for purpose in respect of meeting current health and safety requirements, nor are they able to provide prisoners with the opportunity to undertake the full range of qualifications in hospitality and catering that are available in other prison establishments. The project will involve the closure of 2 separate inefficient buildings and the construction of a more energy-efficient mixed-use building that will serve as a prison kitchen, catering college and cafe to both prisoners and prison staff.
Buckley.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answer and also her invitation to visit the facilities, of which I have replied. Minister, I'm sure you will agree with me that on the face of things £13.3 million on an investment in a kitchen and cafe seems excessive. How confident is the Minister that this will deliver value for money, and is she in a position that she can outline detailed specification and breakdown of costs, because this is of huge concern, particularly given the huge budgetary restraints we have right across government at this time?
Minister.
I'm perhaps more cognizant than most ministers of huge budgetary restraints, given that I've been facing them for much longer than most. Even when there was a surfeit of money available, the Department of Justice never saw the benefit of it. So I am very, as are my officials, aware of the need for value for money. The project will bring a number of benefits. First of all, since 2017, we have spent around £500,000 on the kitchen to maintain the status quo, which is completely inefficient, and that does not represent value for money. The project will also offer more reliable environmentally sustainable energy provision, which will contribute towards the relevant government targets in achieving net zero emissions, and that obviously comes at a premium. It also allows us to improve our rehabilitative offer in the Magilligan site, and crucially, it ensures that the facilities are operational for the size and the capacity of the prison that we now have on that site. I would also say it's a clear indication of my support for the continuation of Magilligan Prison and the investment this represents in the North West region, a matter that has previously exercised many of the Members' Assembly colleagues.
Dixon.
Minister, probably quite surprising that the existing kitchen facilities weren't blown away in the recent storm. But Minister, it is important, given the role of Magilligan Prison, particularly when it comes to rehabilitation and training, that these facilities will actually train people for jobs in life.
Absolutely. Rehabilitation is and must remain the priority of the Northern Ireland Prison Service, and central to that is the prison's 25 by 25 strategy, pillar on our infrastructure, which aims to ensure that we have a fit-for-purpose and secure prison estate. OBC1 approval was granted by the Department of Finance for the redevelopment of Magilligan project. However, because of cost inflation, which we have no control over, NIPS is now proceeding on a phased approach determined by urgent business need. Alongside a new wing at Hallward House, this project forms part of the first phase of essential capital works at Magilligan to deliver a safe, decent and secure environment to facilitate prisoner rehabilitation and prepare them for reintegration into the community at the end of their sentence. I know the member said, somewhat jokingly, that he was surprised that the kitchen hadn't blown away. It would be fair to say that there have been occasions where we have been worried that that might actually happen at Magilligan. It's not a minor issue. We had problems earlier in the year, for example, where the gas supply to the kitchen was damaged, and that involved us having to actually seek external support in order to be able to feed the prisoners at Magilligan. So this is a serious issue, and it is only coming to the head now because it's an absolute crisis that we have to resolve it.
Call Deborah Erskine.
Mr Deputy Speaker, question 4.
My department contributes to a number of priorities within the draft programme for government. However, the ability of my department to deliver on those priorities is dependent on adequate funding being made available. There will be difficult decisions ahead if we continue to have insufficient budget allocation to meet the demand-led pressures of my department. The frontline services delivered across the department must be considered collectively and not as individual areas. The budget outcome for 25-26 and beyond is yet to be confirmed, but is likely to be very challenging for the justice sector as a whole. My department is ambitious to deliver on the priorities as set out in the programme for government for the people of Northern Ireland, and so both I and my officials continue to press for greater resources through regular engagement with the Department of Finance, the Finance Minister and the Executive.
Erskine for supplementary.
Thank you, and I thank the Minister for her answers so far. You talked there about the pressures need to be looked at collectively, but we have a need for increase in police numbers. We had, sadly, 42 females murdered in 8 years. We've increased in hate crime, and we need to look at prevention measures and rehabilitation measures as well. So how is the Minister going to intend to prioritise these pressures in relation to the budget that she receives?
Prioritise it in the manner that I always have. I want to say a couple of things. First and foremost, if we are going to change the rates of femicide in Northern Ireland, if we're going to tackle violence against women and girls, I made very clear that this is an executive-wide approach. It requires changes to our RSE education, for example, within our schools, something that was recommended by Sir John Gillan and never delivered by the ministers. It is something that will require cross-departmental cooperation in terms of changing attitudes to women and girls in society. By the time people come through the department, where we have actually made changes to the law around domestic abuse, for example, around stalking and around sexual offences, the truth is that they're already victims, and it is essentially too late to protect them from harm. Protection from harm means moving upstream. That means working with the Department of Health, as I do, on the domestic and violence abuse strategy, and there is money allocated to that, and also working with TEO to ensure that the violence against women and girls strategy can be fully implemented in a way that is complementary to the domestic and sexual abuse strategy. But it will require difficult decisions, there is no question, and everyone within the justice system will be hurting. So members can expect to get many letters telling them that there are different aspects of the justice sector that are under pressure. That is as true for my department as anywhere else. We're currently carrying between 10 and 12% vacancies as a result of lack of resource.
McLone.
Can I ask the Minister if she will confirm that there will be timed and measurable targets in the final PFG against which her department's progress can be monitored?
I submitted a series of key performance indicators along with my key submissions to the programme for government. My department set out measurable and targets that were both, I think, challenging but achievable. And those will, I think, form part of the annex to the programme for government in due course. But the executive is to meet halfway through the consultation period to discuss further iterations around the programme for government in relation to the feedback that we have received. But yes, from my perspective, I have submitted key performance indicators. Whether or not they're published as part of the programme for government is a matter for others, but they'll certainly be what guide my department.
Andy McMurray.
Thank you to the Minister. Can the Minister give examples of where these financial pressures are being felt within her ministry? Thank you.
I think it would be very difficult to suggest any part of the ministry is not under financial pressure. As things stand at the moment, we have reached the point in the Department of Justice where when we push down on one cost centre, we rise in another. So, for example, if we decide not to do electronic monitoring and invest in that, we push up the cost of probation and policing and increase the risk to the public. If we push down on probation and community-based sentencing, we push up the prison population. If we push down the prison population, we push up the need for community monitoring. And at every stage, if we try to speed up justice, we push up the legal aid bit. So there is no easy fix, and I am not pretending that there is. We need a whole systems approach. That's what I've been endeavouring to do. But it's very clear to me that unless the Department of Justice budget actually starts to match the inflationary pressures that we've faced over recent years, we will not be able to continue to deliver the level of service that we currently do. Mr. Speaker, if we had risen in line with inflation since 2011, we would now have no extraordinary pressures facing the department. It is because the department has been starved of resource that we find ourselves in this situation, and that, with all due respect, is a matter for this Assembly and the wider executive, not just the Department of Justice.
Call Paula Bradshaw.
Every life lost through violence is an unacceptable tragedy, and I think we are all rightly and deeply appalled at the increase in incidents of violence against women in recent weeks. All of us must do everything in our power to challenge and change the attitudes and behaviours which treat women's lives as though they're expendable. There must be a collective effort from across society and government to address these issues. The cases involving 4 of the recent victims are currently being processed through the criminal justice system. Domestic homicide reviews have so far been commissioned in relation to 2 of those cases. However, there is also ongoing work underway to reduce risk and to contribute to an end to violence against women and girls. This includes work under the Domestic and Sexual Abuse Strategy, which is led by my department and the Department of Health, and which was launched by the Health Minister and myself on the 25th of September. The interdependencies between this strategy and the strategic framework on ending violence against women and girls are evident, given that women and girls are disproportionately affected by domestic and sexual abuse. All efforts to address domestic and sexual abuse under the strategy will directly contribute to the broader goals of ending violence against women and girls. However, importantly, we also recognise that violence perpetrated against women and girls is not restricted to domestic situations, and that domestic and sexual abuse can also affect men and boys, reinforcing the need for the Executive Strategic Framework on Violence against Women and Girls to be implemented in parallel with the Domestic and Sexual Abuse Strategy. My officials work closely with the Executive Office on the development of the EVOG framework, and we are committed to continued collaboration and partnership. Our governance structures will ensure alignment and support ongoing joint efforts to protect everyone.
Supplementary from Paula Bradshaw.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for your answer. Can you confirm whether funding will be provided to the community and voluntary sector to allow them to continue their valuable work around ending violence against women and girls? Thank you.
I think, first of all, we would all want to acknowledge and pay tribute to the invaluable role that the voluntary and community sector plays, not only in providing crucial support to victims and survivors, but also in bringing collective knowledge, skills and expertise to inform our strategic policy and operational responses. With the launch of the strategy came the launch of the Domestic and Sexual Abuse Small Grant Scheme. This scheme offers voluntary and community sector members the opportunity to apply for funding to support new ideas and initiatives that align with the strategic objectives of the Domestic and Sexual Abuse Strategy. Initially, these grants will be drawn from our ring-fenced, cross-cutting domestic and sexual abuse funding aimed at supporting the vital work carried out by frontline organisations. Through this initiative, we hope to empower our partners to continue their essential work and make a meaningful impact.
Beattie.
you for the Minister so far. Minister, robust sentencing is another tool towards ending violence against women and girls. Would the Minister agree that sentence credit, where it is a useful tool to get the guilty to admit guilt early, being left to the last moment to admit that and still get the same credit is actually quite negative?
Well, as the member will know, the decisions that are made by the judiciary are entirely independent when it comes to sentencing. However, the issue of sentence credit has been raised by a number of members of the Criminal Justice Board. I think the determining point is what we consider an early plea. Is it on the first day of the trial, which may be early in the perspective of the judge in court, or is it early in the investigation, which could save the police and PPS huge resources in terms of investigation? I believe it should be the latter, not the former, and I think it's important that we actually talk through this with the LCJ and with others around the Criminal Justice Board table to ensure also that people understand the sentencing frameworks that are in place and how they're being applied. Often sentencing appears to be opaque, and the reasons for discounts and other things within sentencing are often misunderstood. The very language of discount is often very offensive to victims. And so I think we do need to work through these issues in a manner that is sensitive to victims and their needs, and that's one of the reasons why I created a Victims of Crime Commissioner designate, in order that she would be able to impartially and without any overtures of political interference raise these sorts of issues in the right way.
Cheryl Brownlee.
Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for answers so far. In terms of revenge porn, it's undeniably a form of sexual abuse which causes significant psychological harm. So, Minister, could you give your assessment on the current effectiveness of the revenge porn legislation?
Sure.
The revenge porn legislation in Northern Ireland is reasonably up to date in the sense that it was first introduced, I think, back in 2014-15, and it was then further refined, as some of your colleagues who sat in the Justice Committee last time will recall, to include threats to release private materials, which is a form of blackmail but also a form of sexual abuse. Where I think there is further work that can be done, and where we've been engaging with the Home Office, is around such issues as deep fake imagery, which is often not as easy to prove in terms of being able to get convictions, but also can be very difficult to detect. And I think with the increase in AI, with the increase in deepfake technology, there is a need for us to be constantly horizon scanning about what needs to come next. There was an intention for a bill to come forward before the general election was called that we'd have looked at this issue in Westminster, but it fell. We are unaware yet whether the Labour government intend to reintroduce some of those measures. They also included, for example, things like a specific offence of spiking. But if the opportunity comes for us to be able to seek legislative consent to piggyback on that legislation, I'd be open to doing so.
Dillon.
To the Minister for your answers so far. Minister, I think when we're talking about violence against women and girls, we need to be clear it's by men. And when you talk about in the domestic setting of men and boys, it's mostly by men. And I think we need to be very honest about that. So in relation to those then that are on remand, which are mostly, as I say, for these cases, men, what can we do in terms of putting something in place? Because very often they are released from prison because they've served their time on remand. We need to make sure that they are getting counselling, anger management, whatever needs to be put in place to protect the women and girls and children around them whenever they are released.
Minister.
Well, I think the member has probably highlighted the most frustrating thing for victims when it comes to holding people on remand. When people are given bail, it's incredibly frustrating at times for victims, particularly where they feel vulnerable or under threat. But what is even more frustrating is if victims then, when they get a conviction, in those cases where that happens, see somebody released time served. So it looks like they haven't been punished for what they did. When they're on remand, unfortunately, we can't compel them to comply because they're an innocent person until proven guilty. We can offer them education, we can offer them rehabilitation, but as most people on remand maintain their innocence until the court trial starts, we often find that people are unwilling to, for example, engage in specific perpetrator programmes. It is something that we are looking at in terms of what we can do before people offend, in terms of working with people at risk of offending or people with a history of offending. What we have found is that with perpetrator programmes, they often work better for those who voluntarily sign up to them than those who are assigned to them by the courts.
Hargay.
6.
Minister.
The Northern Ireland Prison Service takes any allegation of inappropriate behaviour by a member of staff seriously. and has well-established mechanisms to investigate and respond. In the last 5 calendar years, from 2019 to 2023, and inclusive of 2024, there have been 10 allegations of inappropriate behaviour, which have led to disciplinary action and awards under the Northern Ireland Prison Service Professional Code of Conduct.
Thank you for your answer. And just following that, I understand that there was another death in custody at the weekend, and this brings to a total of 4 deaths in the last 5 weeks. It's a concerning picture, and I would just ask what is being done to tackle this concerning situation.
I would caution members, assuming that every death in custody is under suspicious or other circumstances that may be of concern. Many deaths in custody are of natural causes, but we are not able to disclose that kind of detailed information, A, in respect of individual prisoners, until their families have been informed, and B, until the Prisoner Ombudsman has done their full investigation, and indeed until the coroners have reported. But the preliminary findings of the initial at-speed review will often give us an indication whether or not there are any suspicious circumstances or concerning circumstances in terms of welfare or harm surrounding deaths in custody. Many of our prison population are now ageing. Many of them arrive at us from a position of homelessness and often rough sleeping, and are in very poor health when they arrive. Many have drug addictions and mental health problems, and that can make them very vulnerable not only to self-harm or suicidal ideation, but also, sadly, to natural causes deaths.
Can I ask the Minister for an update on any recruitment campaigns within the NI Prison Service, particularly to help deal with the pressures of ever-increasing prisoner numbers?
Well, we have a recruitment campaign which I believe is due to start this autumn. As you know, I had agreed that we should add to the complement of prison officers that we have in order to ensure both that prisoners and prison staff are safe in our establishments, and that we are able to maximise regime. When we are low on numbers, it isn't necessarily that people immediately become unsafe, but it does impact very much on prisoners, their ability to access training, education, their ability to access family visits and other things, because we have to have more restrictive regime when we have fewer numbers. So it's very important for us in terms of rehabilitation, in terms of education, in terms of family support, that we are able to give prisoners the full regime that is available, as well as keeping prison officers and prisoners safe. And so we are going to be recruiting in order to deal with that.
Deputy Speaker.
As reported to the Department of Finance in the urgent in-year budget information gathering exercise, my department is currently facing inescapable stabilisation pressures of 48 million. This position remains unchanged. In addition, my department is also facing exceptional pressures of 227 million in relation to legal claims for McLeod to injury to feelings, data breach and holiday pay, and these costs are not affordable within my department's budget under any circumstance. Whilst my department has been proactive in taking action in recent years to ensure we live within budget, we are now at the point where all options have been fully exhausted. Given the severity of the financial position and the demand-led nature of justice expenditure, there is really no scope for my department to absorb the remaining pressures. I will continue to work with my executive colleagues to ensure that necessary funding for my department is achieved in the October monitoring round.
Owen Tennyson for supplement.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. Minister, what actions have already been taken to live within budget?
Minister.
My department has been proactive in taking difficult decisions to reduce the level of financial pressures to 48 million from 86 million after the June monitoring round. This has not been achieved without adverse impact on the justice system, particularly but not solely with PSNI in terms of the recruitment of police officers. We're also having to manage significant pressures within legal aid, and the department's payment policy is currently the matter of a judicial review. In the absence of sufficient additional funding being allocated to my department, extremely difficult decisions on prioritisation and service provision will continue to be required. As always, our priority is to keep people safe. However, at this stage, it is hard to see how any of the issues that we are doing, whether that be policy development, whether that be legislative progress, or whether it be funding the actual frontline services, doesn't contribute to keeping people safe. We are not running off on fool's errands. We are very focused on core issues that are addressing the key issues that are affecting society.
Matthew Till. Minister.
Section 9.3 of the Justice Sexual Offences and Trafficking Victims Act Northern Ireland 2022 amended the Sexual Offences Amendment Act 1992 to extend the existing anonymity for victims of sexual offences and complainants in sexual offence cases for 25 years after their death. This amendment implemented a Gillen Review recommendations as concerns had been raised with Sir John that a victim's identity may become known after their death with undue distress for their families. Under Section 3A of the 1992 Act, which was inserted by Section 9.3 of the 2022 Act, an interested party can apply to the court after the victim's or complainant's death for an order to have the reporting restrictions disapplied or modified. The reporting restrictions apply only in respect of sexual offences and do not prevent the reporting of a victim's name in relation to other offences that may have been committed, provided such reporting does not lead to the identification of the person as the victim of a sexual offence. The provision was commenced on the 20th of September 2023, and to date one application has been made to disapply reporting restrictions. The application was granted by the court on the 18th of October 2024. This suggests at this early stage the provision is operating as intended. However, as always is the case with new legislation, its operation in the courts will be kept under review, and if members have concerns about it, I would be more than happy to meet with them to discuss it.
Very brief supplementary. Unfortunately, Mr. O'Toole, not time, Mr. O'Toole, for a supplementary. Members, that ends the period for listed questions. We will now move on to 15 minutes of topical questions. Questions 1 and 6 have been withdrawn. I call Danny Donnelly.
I'd like to ask the Minister for an update on the progress of the revised environmental allowance uplift for PSNI civilian staff.
Minister.
I thank the member for the question. I made a commitment to unions and police staff that I would work with the Chief Constable and the Department of Finance to resolve this issue to ensure staff are paid a meaningful rate of revised environmental allowance in recognition of the important role they play within the PSNI in keeping people safe, including in frontline roles. I'm delighted to have assisted in securing the uplift, which is effective from the 1st of April 2025, and an interim payment which was paid to people this year. I also want to acknowledge the patience and understanding demonstrated by police staff while this issue has been ongoing, and for their cooperation as we move forward.
Danny Donnelly.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And also I'd like to ask the Minister if a future review mechanism has been agreed.
The issue of a future review mechanism continues. It was one of the more complex issues in terms of ensuring that there were no repercussive implications. NIPSA are very much part of that conversation, as will the other unions be, and it is our intention to hopefully be in a position to confirm that with the unions as soon as possible, whilst working closely with the Minister for Finance, who I omitted to pay credit to in terms of very quickly clearing the financial agreement once we had the detail in place.
Minister, can you please provide an update on the evaluation of the Connect project as part of the Executive's programme on tackling paramilitarism and organised crime? Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Connect is an executive programme on paramilitarism and organised crime funded Education Authority-led project that sees professionally qualified youth workers based in 2 emergency departments to engage and support vulnerable young people aged 15 to 25 when they are often hard to reach and vulnerable to harm when they arrive in emergency departments. An evaluation report commissioned by the Executive Programme on Paramilitarism and Organised Crime by Queen's University shows that 73% had probable PTSD and depression. Over a quarter had been attacked with a weapon, 45% had been threatened by paramilitaries, and 36% had been attacked by paramilitaries. On completion of the report, the young people were less likely to attend the ED, engage in unlawful behaviour, be exposed to violence, screen for probable depression, and were more likely to be employed. The report, I think, highlights the complex needs of many young people which, if left unaddressed, can make them more vulnerable to violence and criminal exploitation. It also recognised the potential for this approach to further reduce youth violence and demands on hard-pressed critical care services.
Paula Bradshaw.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, would you agree that learning from this project might be useful in other contexts, especially in a time when resources are so constrained and public services so stretched? Thank you.
Minister.
I would absolutely agree with the Minister or with the member. The project, I think, is an excellent example of the use of a public health approach which has been adopted by the Tackling Paramilitarism programme. Undertaking small-scale projects like this to address a specific issue rigorously and robustly testing them and looking to embed and scale them in a way that works. I think the fact that this has been externally verified to have been successful is really important, because if we're going to put our money in such constrained times into projects like this, I think it's important that we mainstream things that we know actually work.
Tennyson.
Deputy Speaker, can I ask the Minister for an update on the rollout of children's sexual offence legal advisors?
Sure.
Cases involving sexual crime are obviously some of the most intrusive and difficult for victims to endure. The impact on children is understandably far more intense. I've met young victims and their families who have told me directly how challenging the criminal justice process can be. The Adult Sexual Offences Legal Advisor, or SOLA, service was launched in April 2021, but there was recognition that due to the greater complexity of child sexual offences, more time was required to develop an equivalent service for children, young people and their families. This additional preparation time has allowed us to engage with children and young people to seek their views on what a child SOLA service can deliver for them. It's also allowed us to learn lessons from the adult scheme. Preparations to launch a specific SOLA service for children and young people are now well advanced. In September, Victim Support NI launched a process to recruit child SOLAs. The application process closed on the 1st of October, and subject to applicants being successful at interview and completing the required training, I anticipate the new service will be operational early in the new year.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. Minister, can you outline what costs might be associated with the future rollout of children's SOLAs?
The future rollout will be £134,000 in 25-26 and £139,000 in 26-27. I think it's really important to recognise the impact that the adult SOLAs have had in terms of the willingness of victims and witnesses, who are often also victims, to turn up and give evidence in court, to feel supported and empowered in doing so, and often will lead to early guilty pleas, which we were discussing earlier in this session. We would hope that with the child SOLAs we are able to tackle some of the challenges that face young people who may find, for example, even attendance at the remote evidence centre quite daunting, and therefore having somebody there who can give not just them but their families legal advice and support as they navigate through the justice system, I think is incredibly important.
Andrew McMurray.
Deputy Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Could I ask the Minister's assessment of the success of the domestic abuse contest courts DACC run in the Belfast Remote Evidence Centre?
Mr.
Yes, since December 2023, the Belfast Remote Evidence Centre has been hosting domestic abuse contest courts, and I struggle with that one too. On a DACC day, several contests are listed to run consecutively, with all victims receiving their evidence, giving their evidence from the REC. There have been 4 DACC days to date, the 12th of December and 11th of March, 13th of May and 23rd of December. A total of 18 cases have been listed to date, with 14 concluded and 4 adjourned to a future date. Of the 14 completed cases, there have been 12 convictions, 9 by guilty plea, meaning the victim did not need to give oral evidence, 3 by guilty verdicts, 2 have been acquittals. There are future days also scheduled. Feedback, particularly from the judiciary and criminal justice organisations, has been extremely positive. Importantly, however, victims have also been extremely positive, with many saying that without the REC they would not have been able to continue with their case, they would not have given evidence, and therefore the perpetrator would, in most cases, have walked free. And so the fact that victims are empowered to turn up in itself makes it more likely that there will be a guilty plea or at least a trial. For some of those cases where people haven't perhaps received the outcome that they would have hoped, they nevertheless felt more empowered by being able to take part in the proceedings, and I think that is incredibly important in terms of people being able to move on with their lives.
Andrew McMurray.
Thank you, Minister. And just could the Minister clarify whether any similar arrangements are in place outside of Belfast and Craigavon?
Although it's not part of the formal REC project, arrangements have been made to allow domestic abuse, male and female victims, to give remote evidence from the Fermanagh Women's Aid Building in Enniskillen. Officials are currently involved in discussions with partners to establish similar arrangements in the Foyle Family Justice Centre. The success, I think, in Craigavon and Belfast indicates that this is the way forward for these very sensitive cases, where victims may either be afraid of confronting their abuser, or maybe afraid of confronting their abuser's supporters. To be able to know with confidence that they're attending a different location means that they're able to give their evidence in the best way possible and with the maximum confidence. It is still a stressful process to go through the courts, but it has certainly been appreciated by those victims who have taken up the opportunity.
This committee is considering their forward work programme on scrutiny of the Justice Bill. What advice would the Minister give them? Should they invite outside organisations to the committee to discuss half a bill, or should they wait until organisations can see all of the content of the bill in order to form judgments on it?
Minister.
Given that most of the external organisations generally comment on the policy intent of the bill rather than the legislative clauses, it would probably be wise to consult on the policy content of the entire bill, which is something that is now known to the committee. However, if the committee, as is its wont, wish to wait until they have all the clauses, that will be completed, as we had already indicated, before Christmas, and potentially, in some good news, even slightly earlier than anticipated.
Right.
Her answer. I was going to ask the Minister when she will publish the missing parts of her Justice Bill. I also have a concern when the Minister will introduce the sentencing bill, and can she reassure this House that it won't be half a bill?
Minister.
Well, two things. I can reassure the member absolutely that it won't be half a bill. The sentencing bill in terms of policy is a much wider bill in terms of its extent and the size of the bill. Whilst the Justice Bill is wide in scope, it is narrow in focus, as you will understand, on the particular issues and very technical in nature. The Victims Bill is not. It is much more wide-ranging. It covers many very sensitive issues that have been raised with members in this House and that I have been lobbied to deliver. My anticipated scheme is one bill per year. That remains my intent. What will determine whether or not that bill passes is what scheduling the committee choose in terms of their scrutiny of the Justice Bill, whether they're wanting to manage 2 or potentially 3 bills at once or not, because there is real jeopardy with, I think, a proposal for an 18-month committee stage that we will not actually be able to get the sentencing bill or potentially the Victims Bill through in this mandate.
Claire Sugden.
Deputy Speaker. Minister, to build on that last point, last week we heard criticism from Peter Doling regarding the delay of the sentencing bill, and it is welcome that you plan to introduce this bill next year. However, is it likely that the committee extension stage is likely to delay that even further, and is there a risk that this bill will not meet all its stages in this mandate?
Minister.
Well, I very much share the views of Enda Dolan's parents. I have met them on a number of occasions and sought to reassure them that this is a priority for me. We have issued draft instructions in terms of what needs to be done around this, and the policy intent is very clear. We've shared that with the family. For 5 of the last 10 years, we have had no assembly. I can't control that, with respect, Mr Deputy Speaker, and that has been the largest part of the delay. I agreed in the last mandate that we would do this. The Assembly fell again, so we're back to where we are now, but the bill is moving forward. I cannot guarantee what business the Assembly will schedule, what time the committee will take. These are matters for this Assembly and this House, but I can guarantee that my department will bring forward a sentencing bill in line with the legislative programme.
Will the Minister outline the impact of not taking forward the sentencing bill to the wider criminal justice system?
Minister.
Well, it's, if I could describe it as this, the Justice Bill that we're bringing forward is a lot of unfinished business on a lot of small, very discrete and technical areas, but it is very important because a number of pieces of it are court required. But it doesn't have a huge impact in terms of its reach into the community. However, the latter 2 bills of this mandate certainly do. The sentencing bill, for example, will cover things like the aggravators for hate crime. It will cover the aggravated offences for attacking public service workers. It will cover the changes that we are hoping to make in terms of death by dangerous and intoxicated driving. It will also cover Charlotte's Law, which I know a number of members of this House in terms of Charlotte Murray's family and also Lisa Dorian's family will be aware that they have invested a huge amount of energy and effort in ensuring that we were able to get a version of Helen's Law that I believe is actually superior to what has been introduced in England and Wales. If that bill is not passed, that will fall to the next mandate. And with all due respect to the House, given our reputation for moving swiftly and smoothly from one mandate to another, I would understand why the families may despair at that thought. In terms of the Victims Bill, there is also an issue specifically around the Victims Bill, because we need to put the Victims Commissioner on a statutory footing, as well as finish Gillen, which again is a very important piece of work that needs to happen.
Sinead McLaughlin, I'd point out we have 1 minute left.
Okay, thank you, Minister, for your answer so far. Minister, I've had many constituents that have come into my office and they've had dreadful experiences with the family court system, and I've spoken to you about that. Do you agree that there really needs to be an overhaul of that system, that we really make victims the centre of all of the processes?
Minister.
The issue with the family court system is that it is essentially a judge-led system, and therefore the changes, if you like, in the law that we bring forward in this chamber are still at the discretion in terms of scheduling and other things that happen within the court system. We did introduce additional protections for those where there was domestic abuse involved, so that they couldn't cross-examine each other and that they couldn't use the courts vexatiously, and also to provide additional financial support. But ultimately, at the heart of the family justice system is the child. That should be paramount in cases where they are making decisions and where judges are making decisions on the future of a child. And I would recommend for any member who is concerned that that has not been the case in any particular case to write to the OLCJ or to write to the LCJ and draw the case to her attention.
Okay, time is up. Mr. O'Toole.
Speaker, I was just wondering if any guidance exists for you, yourself, or the other deputy speakers around providing a plurality of questions, including from the official opposition. Twice, I note, during the previous question time, I was denied supplementary questions when time existed.